All right, my 1 minute timer went. We'll kick into things, and people who are joining, I'm sure, will be able to pick up the thread. Welcome back to CarbonCurious for 2024. Happy New Year to everybody. I think I can still say that because it's still just barely January. Today we are talking about sort of a bit of an update on the current state of the carbon markets, and the reason that this is especially topical for ETS forestry participants is that with the start of January, we're back into the emissions return filing windows for recognition of removals that occurred or emissions that occurred in 2023. So we'll be going through some of the tooling that we've implemented over the last few months to help support that for our customers and make that a simpler experience. But it will, even for anybody working with forest and the ETS, it'll sort of help you have a bit of an idea of what's in store and what you need to make sure we do. With me today, one-upping me by wearing a cool-looking company t-shirt, which I forgot about and just wore my normal one, is Hille, who's head of engineering. And he'll be taking you through some of the actual platform functionality that we've implemented around emissions returns in particular. But in connection with that, you'll see some of what the CarbonCrop platform enables for forestry management, for registered forestry in general. As usual, questions, we've got a number that have been submitted in advance, but if you have any you would like to ask, press the little Q&A icon and fire them up. We should have some time at the end of this to get through a decent number of them. And then finally, before I get into the details of today's session, do not trade on this information. This is not a forecast or a prediction. We do not have any special insights around the future regulations or industry trends or primary or secondary market prices. If we did, then we'd be running prop trading groups making a fortune on carbon markets. Most of this is publicly available information, which we are just trying to repeat in a form that hopefully helps you understand what the factors that have been influencing recent price trends have been and how they might impact you in your forest. With all that said, a quick look back over 2023, which was a pretty crazy year in many respects, and not just because of carbon, but most of this is recap, but you'll see this in the price curves later on. Around about sort of the April to June period of 2023 in particular, there were some significant ETS price falls, and these were following some reviews both of the auction price control settings, which significantly suppressed the price, and then a consultation on the form of the ETS in general, and particularly future possible actions to separate the forestry and compliance markets for ETS, both of which led to market sentiment that significantly suppressed the price. In the July to September period, following a challenge by Lawyers for Climate Action, I think is the name of the group, who I applaud their efforts, the High Court ruled that the government's reduced ETS auction price controls were unlawful in consideration of the Climate Change Response Act, and the price controls were revised to align with the Climate Change Commission guidance, which led to a significant immediate price recovery. Following on from that, jumping ahead of myself, in the October to December period, the new fees came into effect. We've spoken about these in the past, and I'll share a little more in a moment. However, a combination of the Climate Forest Association, New Zealand Institute for Forestry, Forest Owners Association, and Ngā Puatane all filed a claim for judicial review of those fees with the High Court. Many of the new fees are now currently in effect, but as I'll mention in a moment, to our knowledge, the fees for annual registration of forest in the ETS have not yet been levied, and the current status we're not sure on. If you're a customer of ours and you have been invoiced for those fees by MPI, please let us know. Also, in the October period, a new government was elected. And as part of that, the proposed ETS reforms have been put on hold or abandoned. And finally, in December, the auction failed to clear again. And that was especially significant because while in most of the auctions through the course of last year, their failure just meant that the available units rolled forward to be available for purchase in the following auction, the December auction failure meant that all of those units are completely removed from the available supply, absent future action to amend the supply the total auction supply units for the future, which means that the potential stockpile of units is significantly reduced versus what it might have otherwise been, which has implications for supply and demand, which I'll share in a moment. Now that we're in January, provisional emission returns are open. This is basically the mechanism by which forestry participants are able to file with MPI saying my forest has achieved this much carbon sequestration or this much carbon loss over the last year and receive units or have an obligation to repay units proportional to those losses. Unlike the last emissions returns in early 2023, these ones are provisional and optional. This contrasts with the final emissions returns, previously called mandatory emissions returns, which you must file, and they are final for the reporting period in question. And most forest owners choose to file these returns because they're the mechanism by which you can get NZUs sooner, which means that you can sell your NZUs, which you can realize get some cash flow from your carbon sequestration. And then looking a little bit further ahead, we've got another ETS auction coming up in March, which is quite interesting in terms of the differences in the price control thresholds versus past auctions. So talking about the new ETS fees, most of the new fees, as I mentioned, are now in effect. It's this annual fee in particular which is being contested, although actually the judicial review covers all of the new fees, I think. To our knowledge, it hasn't yet been levied against registrants. It was expected to be, invoices were expected from MPI to forest owners in November. We are continuing to reflect the annual fee in all of our modelled returns for forests because it's currently regulated that fee will be charged, and we will continue to reflect it in our models until, if or when it is formally withdrawn, which we hope it will be because we think it has significant perverse negative incentives, especially for native forest restoration. On the topic of the upcoming auction, so the next one is on the 20th of March, 2024. It runs from 9 AM to 12 PM as the bidding window. A correction that I got from Karen Lynn at NZX, a clarification from our last update. So I think when I was talking to Quinton, we mentioned a minimum purchase in the ETS auction of 5,000 units, which was an error. It's 500 unit minimum purchase. So it's a lot more accessible than we thought it was if you happen to be interested in buying units as opposed to selling units. You still have to go through a registration process and post collateral in advance. There's quite a lot to it. Basically go to the ETS auction website if you're interested and go through the process, but that's the thresholds. The interesting thing though for this auction is that the quantity of NZUs available is quite small. So I think most of the auctions last year were around 4.25 million units, with a minimum price threshold of somewhere in the $30 from memory. The price floor has been increased significantly for 2024. So this is a different thing from the confidential reserve price, which you might have heard of in the past. Basically, the price floor is that the threshold below which no units will be sold, no matter what activity occurs within the secondary market and the lead up to the auction. So it essentially sets a minimum level at which any units at all will be sold within that auction. Then we've got two tranches from the cost containment reserve, but as you can see, they don't kick in under the new settings until pretty high prices. So if the auction clears at above $184 or at or equal to $184, there's another 2.8 million units available. There's another 4.9 million at $230, but the secondary market price today is around $71. It would be a very positive auction result for those people holding NZUs or expecting NZUs for any of these cost containment reserve blocks to be released. Taking a quick look at just how many NZUs are out there. Now this is relevant because the NZU market and the price activity within that market is basically, well, this is a very broad sweeping statement, so apologies for the generalization, but the price is largely set by what future emitters with surrender obligations within the ETS, so this is like a company that has to meet surrender obligations once a year, what they think that they might have to pay in the future to secure the NZUs to meet those surrender obligations. And because they only have to surrender a certain number of units every year, the number of privately held NZUs that are out there sloshing around has quite a significant impact on what they think they might have to pay in the future, because there's a question of how many people are there who might be willing or able to sell to them. There's a lot of speculation around exactly how many of the sort of currently 160 million or so NZUs that are privately held are actually available, for want of a better word, because some of those NZUs are likely associated with forests being managed under a stock change methodology that people are expecting to harvest, and so they're holding the NZUs in reserve to meet the harvest obligations, and others are being held as essentially, the theory is a buffer or a sort of a hedge by major emitters who want to have a certain amount of NZUs on hand just so that they're protected from price fluctuations by not necessarily having to go to the market and pay the spot price to meet the surrender obligations. But you can see there were some interesting dynamics over the last 2 years. So this big dip from March 2022 to June 2022 is due to all of the unit surrenders that were made at that time of year. And that quantity is sort of on the order of, 25 million is pretty typical. You'll note that then there was the steady increase in the number of units on hand through September, December, and March with the clearance of those auctions. So all of those auctions cleared and the units were sold out. Contrast with 2023, where the dip from March to June was much smaller than usual. And there was actually some speculation at the time over why that was. Why was the surrenders so much lower than they usually are? It seems from what I could see in the EPA records that the total quantity of surrenders for that total reporting period was pretty similar to what it usually is. It's just a lot of the remaining volume occurred in September and December rather than being surrendered in June, which would align with the normal surrender deadline. I don't know why that delay was, but the total surrendered volume seemed roughly correct. What's interesting is that the volume of forestry units that were issued through this period was so much larger than usual due to, my understanding is it being the end of a mandatory emissions reporting period covering 5 full years, that it compensated to the tune of roughly 10 million units beyond what was expected for the other surrendered units. And the other thing we note here is that none of the auctioned units last year cleared. So I think that's true. I can't remember actually what happened with the very first auction. I think none of the units cleared, which means that all of the supply through the whole year didn't sell, and we don't see that new supply in the stockpile, which means that the stockpile is roughly 15 million units lower than it would have been if last year's auction had sold out. Another useful thing to keep an eye on is your if you have NZUs, and therefore basically whether you want to or not, you have a potential speculative position in NZUs, is looking at what is projected to happen with the balance of NZU supply and demand over the coming years, because that's what's going to influence the availability of NZUs for those looking to surrender NZUs to meet their legal obligations, and hence the price. So MFE prepare this unit flow forecast. There's a bunch of, this is just a forecast. It is not guaranteed to happen. This is their best guess. And you'll see that this, down on the bottom left here, there's a forecast of the difference of supply versus demand. That's the amount by which you would expect, all else being equal, the stockpile to shrink by each year. You'll notice that last year they expected the stockpile to shrink by 13 million through a difference in supply and demand. Funny thing is that it shrunk by roughly 13 million, but it shrunk by about that much despite the fact that a full 15 million auctioned units weren't sold. And I think the reason that it only shrunk by 13 million rather than by the 25 million or 28 million that you might expect is that the unit supply through forestry removals was much higher than expected because of these legacy effects of it being for a full 5-year period and some people not having made any claims for that period at that stage. But this is sort of, all else being equal, roughly the rate at which you would expect the stockpile to drop over the coming years, assuming that the upcoming auctions all clear and that the forestry removals and other factors are in line with projections. Looking at the latest price action, and I've drawn 2 little lines on here. So this is from EMS TradePoint, which they've kindly allowed us to share with you all. Here we see the low point in the middle of last year, which was where there was all of this uncertainty around the impacts of future potential ETS reforms and regulatory change. Once the removals or the changes to restore the price controls were implemented, the price recovered quickly. And it's now been, you can see, pretty much trading in a band over the last, better part of 6 months of between $65 and $70 with a little sort of brief price spike up to around 75. The current price last time I checked was about 71. And the new thing that's been introduced as of the start of this year is that as far as the options are concerned, no units will be sold under the current settings for anything less than $64. So that creates a bit of a floor on the price, not a hard floor, because it could just be that people decide, I'm not going to buy any units at the auctions, and there's a lot of supply coming on through forestry. But it's certainly the secondary market seemed to be not, as you can see, not dipping down below that $64 point, and recently more trending up above $70. So Harness is going to talk you through the process that you need to go through if you're a person who owns registered forest in the ETS to get your units. Key point is that once you have your units, you have options. Receiving them doesn't compel you to sell them. They don't expire under the current rules. They can just sit there in your holding account in the emissions trading register, but you can choose to sell them if you want to. You can only file an emissions return between January and June. An important thing to note, though, is that unlike last year, where if your forest hadn't been registered by the 31st of December, you were not eligible for the legacy units between the 2018 to 2022 period, this year, even if your forest is not currently registered, if it becomes registered over the next 6 months, you will be eligible you can then immediately file a return and claim all of the change in your carbon balance from the 2023 period. And actually, I said the next 6 months. If your forest becomes registered at any point between now and the end of 2025, you will be eligible for all of the change in your carbon balance that has occurred from the start of 2023 through to that point. You don't get this kind of like lost historic entitlements within the mandatory emissions period, which is currently running from 1st January 2023 to 31st December 2025. A lot of what we're working on is trying to simplify this process for you and make sure that it's easy to be like complete, correct, compliant returns that you've got confidence in, and we've got confidence in acting on your behalf. We had a pretty good process for this last year, but there were a lot of improvements that we wanted to make, especially around the security of interaction. So we've integrated a lot of the reporting and review functionality into our platform, and that's what I'm shortly going to hand over to Hannes to take you through and share with you. And by shortly, I mean right now. I wasn't sure if I had another slide in between, but Hannes, over to you. Do you want me to drop this slide and let you share the screen, or do you want to run through it first and then pick it up?
If you want to take the slides, and then I'll jump in and share my screen when it comes to demo time.
Okay, cool.
All right, thanks very much for that, Nick. So I'm Hannes. I'm the lead software engineer at CarbonCrop, and this is quite exciting. I get to share some of the software that we've built over the last wee while here on this presentation with you guys. So first up, I want to talk about getting paid for 2023's carbon. It's quite an exciting time. And then talk about your kind of 10-year forecast, like how much do you think you're going to earn next year and the year after that. And thirdly, if you're planning something, like we often get questions about what happens if I plant a certain area of my land out in natives, how much money am I going to get? How that could look like in our platform, modeling some scenarios. So you've got the next slide. First up is provisional emissions return. So Nick touched on this a little bit already. It's the process by which you earn New Zealand units. And it is optional this year. However, despite it being optional, we still have to make sure that all the information in there is correct. So the first step as part of provisional emissions return is that CarbonCrop, together with you as the landowner, needs to account for changes on your forest and your land. So that means if there's been any wind throw or slips or harvesting that's happened, or if there's been new planting within your registered areas, we need to know about that so that we can make sure that you're compliant. Then we submit this information with MPI by submitting a PER. And then lastly, you and your New Zealand units, and CarbonCrop takes our share. So I'll show a demo of that. Most of our CarbonCrop landowners will have received an email already asking you to provide some information about your land. So just checking, is that showing up for you, Nick?
That's looking good.
Fantastic. So in your email, you would have gotten something a little bit like this. Ask for some landowner input. And this is just to make sure that we can remain compliant about your emissions return. We first tell you a bit about what an emissions return is. Then we talk a bit about your predicted returns so that you know what to expect for this emissions return. And then we ask you a bunch of questions. And like I said, these are kind of for compliance reasons. So firstly, we need to know if there's been any change of ownership in your land, if there's been a significant change of the owners, or if you've subdivided and sold part of your land, especially if that land has registered areas. We need to know about that. Then if there's been any changes to your forest details. So As CarbonCrop, we make the best effort. We use AI and satellite imagery to monitor for harvesting or wind throw and slips on your land, but we can still miss stuff. So while we make a best attempt, we still need to know from you. For the things that we have already detected on the land, we will show you a map. So in this example here, we're looking at an adverse event that happened, like a slip down here, and some planting that you might have communicated with us last year. That will be on this map. If there is anything that happened on your land in the year that you don't think is covered by the map, do tell us. Like, for compliance reasons, we do need to know about that. You might find also, like, of course, here it says adverse event, but there are still trees there. The imagery from this map here might be older than the start of the year, but we still have information about that.
I think it'd be worth noting maybe, Hannes, that the imagery that we're using to detect the adverse events isn't this imagery that you're seeing here, precisely because it can be sort of a couple of years out of date. And we're using much more recent satellite imagery in our scans to try and identify any events that have occurred over the course of 2023.
Correct.
And also to note, 2023 is the period that matters. If your forest has fallen down at the start of 2024, that matters a lot, but it's not actually as relevant for your 2023 emissions return, which is for events that occurred between the beginning of 2023 and the end of 2023.
Yeah. If your forest did fall down at the start of 2024, please also let us know, because it might change if it's actually worth filing a PER or not as well, because it might be that by the end of the emissions return period, you might have to surrender a heap of units. So talk to us and we can iron that out.
Cool.
And lastly, are there any areas you'd like to remove from the ETS? This can be easier done before we file an emissions return rather than after, so we ask you about it. And then if there's anything else you'd like to let us know about, type it into this box. So this process here of sending a form is a new thing that we're trialing this year. Last year, this was all done over phone calls and emails, and there wasn't as much of a record of getting this information securely. This way here is much more secure, both for us and for you as a landowner to collect that. Once you're happy, click complete, and then we will go and file the emissions return. You should hear from us back reasonably soon, and we'll let you know once the units have made it into your account. So that's the first thing about provisional emissions return. Next up is your 10-year forecast. So yeah, you've been paid for this year. How much are you going to get paid next year? Available to all people that have a CarbonCrop platform is this emissions return, as the registered areas report. Let me just jump that up here. And that looks like this. You can see it from your landowner input page. You click here on the click here to view a registered areas report. If you don't yet have a CarbonCrop account, it'll ask you to log in and create an account. And we've got some guides on how to do that. And that'll show you this registered areas report here. In this report, you'll see a map of the land and all the registered areas that we know about, and give you a brief idea of the forecast units. You'll also be able to see a table of year by year how many units we expect to earn. And from this, already subtracted off the CarbonCrop service fee and emissions return filing fees. And you'll also be able to see a graph of the forecast financial returns for your registered areas as well. So this is already in the CarbonCrop platform. You always have to create an account to log in and view that. And then thirdly, something I want to present, which is quite exciting, is if you're planning something. For example, we get questions quite often: what if I plant 5 hectares of native? How much money am I going to make? Or what if I harvest all my pines? What's going to happen? And we're working on some tools that will let you answer this yourself. So I wanted to show a bit of a demo on that. So over here, I've got this test site, and I've got these registered areas that you saw in the map before. And I've got this area of pasture here that, let's say I'm thinking of planting out. I can use the new polygon tool to describe the area that I want to draw or use for planting. I'm just going to shape this area around here. And then I can use the tools up on the right here to enter some attributes about this land. So let's say I'm planning to plant this next year in 2025. And I'm planning to plant this with a species of Manuka Kunuka to get some early regenerating forests in here. Then clicking on that and clicking on the financials tab gives me a kind of credit forecast here of those. So I can see that, yeah, this being native forest, it kind of takes a little while to ramp up, but it's going to earn me close to $10,000 a year for that. So these planting tools, they can be used to forecast the different kind of species rates. If you're interested in planting a different species, you can choose that from the species list and see that impact on your financial returns. And so this is like the first stage of like kind of planning to plant and forecasting tools. We're planning to build a lot more out of this.
I think it's worth noting, Harness, and we'll get to this in a moment, that there's quite a few assumptions that are underpinning those forecasts as well. One of them is the carbon sequestration rate, where the numbers that we're using is the lookup table values from MPI for the ETS for the species category that you have indicated that you're using. And the other is the price, where we're using a speculative projection of the future NZU forest price, which is like got a lot of assumptions in it around what the future regulatory environment is and what the future eligibility to earn units is and blah, 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 plus the price trend, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But it's certainly very useful to help you inform what you're doing, but very important that you understand the assumptions that underpin it, and you can consider whether those assumptions represent assumptions that you're happy to make, or apply whatever kind of scaling you're happy with. Because it's not guaranteed. Like there's very much assumptions. This is forward-looking stuff. There's changes that could happen in the regulatory environment or the market environment, which would change the results.
Indeed. Also, it means that the land that you're planting on is post or alternative post-1990 forest land, and that there wasn't forest there before 1990 that was harvested. Okay. So yeah, one example here is we have actually, Nick, do you want me to take this one on, or do you want to take it?
You go for it. I talk too much anyway.
Great.
I'll butt in if I disagree.
Yeah. So we had one question here, which is, I have a 10-acre block currently with 400 avocado trees. I'm slowly rewilding the block in 9 zones. So 10% of it is done so far. Spent $5,000 on planting meters. Are there any financial planning or offset trees that I could access? So in terms of financial planning, that's what our tool will help you. So 10 acres is roughly 3 hectares. So with our tool, you'll be able to, and of course, this makes much more sense on your block of land, draw a polygon that shows your kind of initial planting zones and get a financial forecast for those. So over here, I've got a 3.7 hectare block, probably slightly more than 10 acres. And then given the assumptions of the MPI lookup tables, we can get some idea for the financials. Once I, of course, put the establishment year of them. And then that will give me the kind of financial forecast data for that block, which is, of course, not going to load because it's a demo. There it is. So this should help a lot with the kind of financial forecasting of this block. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Nick?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So firstly, the current status of the land will be a significant factor. So you say 400 avocado trees across what's roughly 3.5 hectares. So you've already got 100 trees per hectare. There's a pretty good chance that depending on the canopy coverage, you'll be close to forest state, at least from a canopy perspective anyway. You cannot register fruit trees that are present primarily for fruit production purposes within the ETS. There's actually some exceptions to amenity trees or other things, but separately from that is the status of that land as pre-90 forest land would be a question depending on how long those avocado trees have been there. If the avocado tree density and or tree status is insufficient to qualify as forest land, there's still a question of timing, because obviously, like as you're finding out going through the process, costs quite a lot to establish directly 10 acres of land as new native forest with direct planting. You're 10% through and you spent $5,000 already. You can't register it until you've got at least 1 hectare. And because of some of the new fee structures, it's generally not cost effective to register a single hectare. So again, these are scenarios that you can explore with the tools, but it's probably not going to be worth looking to register it until you're most of the way done. And then you'll need to carefully assess whether it's even possible for you to register it given the historic forest status. And also, given the numbers Harness just shared, it's not likely that you're going to be able to cover all of your costs of forest establishment through the carbon revenue from the property, at least not in the short term. But at least it'll do something to cover the costs, and you'll be able to get a reasonable understanding of what the amount you receive might be. I think we lost your audio there, Hannes.
I have this one back up video about the CarbonCrop NZD scenarios.
Okay, excellent. Cheers, Hannes. Can you, so basically, I think this ties in with one of the questions as well, as what's our expectation of the future NZU price? The short answer is we don't know. And I mean that very seriously. Firstly, we don't know, and we wouldn't want to present ourselves as knowing, but we also know that it's not very helpful for us to just give you guys a bunch of NZU numbers and then make you copy them all over into a spreadsheet and perform your own analysis. So we tried to share a representative possible scenario. And what you see here on the right, it's very much a speculative scenario, but the green line is what our forecasts are prepared using. The current price is around about $71. The blue line is basically a convergence to the low end of the Climate Change Commission's indicated required future price to help New Zealand achieve its decarbonisation goals. The long and short of it is, the Climate Change Commission's view is that unless the carbon price within the ETS achieves a certain level, it's unlikely that it will sufficiently disincentivise emissions for us to achieve our emissions reduction targets. That number actually keeps moving over time because, like in many regions now, solar photovoltaics are the cheapest form of electricity generation that there are. And the price trends on battery electric vehicles are such that it may soon be that a battery electric vehicle is cheaper, considering running costs, than a internal combustion vehicle. And as those thresholds are crossed, the disincentive to emit that you need to have to force a change in behaviour drops. But these are the numbers that the Climate Change Commission has now. They sort of stabilise in around the region of $150 to $250. At the lower end of the band, like, you could actually be a lot more conservative. It could be that if forestry is forced into a separate market, and depending on the regulatory mechanisms associated with that market and the purchasing models, the price might be even lower. So there's no guarantees here. We're just trying to share a middle of the road scenario. NZU prices may well not evolve like this, and these are the risks that you have to consider when you're participating in the market. If there was a structural reform to the ETS, I mean, whether they're likely or not to change the unit prices depends on the nature of the structural reforms, but clearly the market's interpretation of some of the potential reforms signalled last year was that they would lead to different prices, hence the price change. If you jump ahead, another one, Hannes. Another key thing to note is that if the prices fall and the fees stay fixed, then your profit drops, and you need to consider that. And because of all of this and the uncertainty, we're looking at making some improvements to the platform to allow you to, if you jump ahead one, Hannes, basically explore the different scenarios across our standard price scenarios, and also specify your own price scenario. So if you decide that the only value that you're comfortable in using for your projections is $30 per unit, you would be able to get a customized forecast in your registered area report or in your planned planting report that assumed a future price of 30 units flat, with $30 per unit flat with no changes. And then you can look at the results and decide whether, on balance, that's something that you're comfortable with and you're keen to proceed, or if you'd rather not do it because you're just not confident enough. Next slide. Right, I think that's all of the core content. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. We'll be back around about this time next month with another update on, I think it's talking about future forest mixes, interestingly enough. But until then, have a great small remainder of the January, and a great February.